Good morning. And there is the last class of the year. Can you believe? Quite amazing. So we have seen last time the followers of Caravaggio, who were numerous, and we know how much influence Caravaggio had on painters of the 17th century. But so did the Carraccis, and particularly because of the academy they had founded in Bologna. The academy brought lots of people around and produced some extremely high quality students. They also, but interestingly enough, we will see how pretty much actually following the teaching of the academy gathered all the best of all the styles that were around. And so often they've been criticized for being eclectic, but in fact, what they say, they got the lessons and they formed a slightly new style. So I'm giving you a timeline here that gives us an idea of who they are. In green, by the way, are painters, in blue, architects and sculptors that we're going to see today. So the two main painters that are going to teach at the academy are Ludovico and Agostino, who were first cousins. I didn't add Annibale because he spent most of his time in Rome and died pretty young. So he had an influence on the people when they joined him in Rome, and we'll talk about that. So I also added Caravaggio, so you have an idea on how he sits there time-wise. So among the main names that follow the Carraccis are Guido Reni, probably the most important, extremely very, very good painter, but also had quite a career. Dominici, Giovanni Lampanco, and Guercino. We will see at the end of the class the architect Carlo Maderno, and then the sculptor Stefano Maderno, Pietro Bernini, the father of Gianlorenzo Bernini, and Francesco Martin. So Guido Reni was born in Bologna, so the same city as the Carraccis, in 1575. He first apprenticed to the Bolognese studio of the Flemish painter Denis Calvar, then went on 11 years later to study at the academy that had been founded by the Carracci. In 1601, he's going to move to Rome to work with Annibale Carracci at the Farnese Palace. And that's the famous fresco that I showed you in the ceiling of the Galleria Farnese. In 1614, he returned to Bologna, then went for a short stay in Naples in 1616, but by fear of being poisoned, and I'm going to talk about that a little more, he went back to Bologna and stayed there until 1642 when he died. The story of Naples and the fear of poisoning is quite real. We will see that another painter got poisoned. They were very particular in Naples. There was a group of painters, and they wanted to keep the main position and didn't want good painters to join. And they literally went to poison the painters so that they would be out of the way. So it's quite incredible. So this is a painting, by the way, by Denis Calvar, who produced most of the time rather small format painting. And as this one shows, he also used a lot of copper as support for his painting. Very handsome painter, does some beautiful pieces. For whatever reason, he is that kind of second-rank painter that many people have never heard about. but he did some extremely nice work, but was an excellent teacher. And so he attracted a lot of students in Italy. And you can see the work, you can almost guess that this is uncovered just by the neatness and the brightness of the painting. So some of the, by the way, he was called, that's what I want to say, Dionisio Fiammingo, which means Denis for Dionisio and Fiammingo, the Flemish one. So that was, yes.
Those faces almost look like by Rubens.
I would say more Correggio. But in the early works of Rubens, I agree with you, but all this, don't forget, Rubens is in Italy from 1600 to 1609. So he's there. So one of the biggest commission that he will get beginning in 1607 is by Scipione Borghese, who was the art-loving nephew of Camillo Borghese, who was Pope Paul V. And so he gave him a series of very important commissions where he was assisted by other pupils of Annibale Carracci. So in this case, it is the commission he received to paint the Pope's private chapel in the Palazzo del Quirinale. As you can see, just beautiful chapel. And in there, not only did he paint, but he also did a lot of trompe-l'oeil architecture painting that was at that time quite fashionable. The actual painting took a total of 7 months, but he was paid on the period of 2 years. So this is always the problem of these poor painters, that they have to, you know, get money out of their pocket to advance for the works. In this work, he's going to be helped by Giovanni Lampanco, who we will see later, Francesco Albani, and then one of the sons of the Carracci, Antonio Carracci. These are really considered some of the masterworks of Guido Reni. You can see here a detail of one of the lunettes, showing the presentation of Mary to the temple. And very beautiful image of Mary brought by Anne, her mother, Saint Anne, to the grand priest. It's a very nice composition, and you can see there how he really learned from the Carraccis, who were really emphasizing the importance of a good composition. And we're studying not only Michelangelo, but Raphael very much. This is another of the painting in that place, showing the birth of the Virgin. In beautiful decor with people just going on with their own life. You know, it's quite interesting that the baby is born and she's going to have such a role, and life goes on all around. This is, by the way, influenced by some woodcut by Dürer. Dürer had made a series of prints on the life of the Virgin, and that were published in 1512. And that, of course, he had sent to Italy, and the Italians were very fond of any engravings that he was doing. In this case, it's a woodcut, and they were selling extremely well, therefore spreading his art in the north of Italy. A detail of one of the servants. And you see in the background, you see Anne on her bed. The most known work that he did, though, is in the Palazzo Pallavicini, yes, of the Aurora, and showing the beautiful frescoes in the ceiling of that gallery in the Casino Rospiglioso. This was, of course, a mythological story, kind of more allegorical than mythological, but showing really the end of the day when the sun is going to set. He was a great admirer of Raphael, definitely, but he's also influenced by Caravaggio, and we'll see in some later work how he loves the tenebrism of Caravaggio. And we have to admit that Caravaggio brought some emotions and some theatrical side to the paintings that were unique to him and that were almost inexistent in the Carraccis. And so they adapted, if you want, that tenebrism of Caravaggio to the composition that they were creating, that were following more what the Carraccis were doing. Here's an enlargement, and you see very Raphael-esque the figures that are around, but it's almost like a dance, and it's absolutely beautiful, very elegant, but very classical still. So he's not moving, as we'll see in the high Baroque period, starting in January. He is not doing this big spatial research that we will see with Piero da Cortona, for example, but is really looking for harmony, very much following Raphael. It is also, as Carracci had done in the Galleria Farnese, what is called quadri riportati, which means it is framed by a painted frame. It's not an actual frame, but instead of having that thing melting down in the architecture, you have the quadri riportati. He made many other kind of paintings, religious painting. This is the famous Saint Mary Magdalene. I think she was a very attractive subject for many of the painters, from Titian to Caravaggio, and in this case, more in the vein of Titian is his Mary Magdalene, showing her long hair, where she is supposedly in meditation out in the desert, not in the desert, but in the wilderness, when she actually went away from life to be just fed by angels. And you can see her hand resting on the skull, which then connotes right away the idea of the meditation. He was also, he would get these incredible portraits, and I'm totally in love with the next painting, because I love these faces. It's absolutely beautiful, the highlight on this white hair. And then you have that beautiful expression of the older man looking at that young child. And the contrast between the two is absolutely superb. It makes me feel like I want to touch his beard, you know, to see if it's real. It's extraordinary. So this is Saint Matthew and the angel. Saint Matthew, of course, in the process of writing the gospel and getting his inspiration from the angel. This is where you see the influence of Caravaggio, by the way. But the face is much more detailed than what Caravaggio would give, and more classical also in setting. But I think it's an extraordinary painting. And then another one, Saint Jerome. Typical again, this is Saint Jerome, who is also out in the wilderness, writing his Vulgate, the translation from the Hebrew into Latin, and being inspired by an angel. Quite a drastic representation of an older man.
Why is there a lion?
Why is he?
The lion.
Yeah, the lion as always comes with Saint Jerome. The story goes that while he was in the desert, he had met that lion that had a thorn in his paw. And he was able to tame the lion enough that the lion authorized him to remove that thorn. And from that time on, that lion became his pet and stayed with him all along. And there is an additional story that when he finally leaves the desert and comes back into the monasteries, the other monks were terrified by that lion. And then one day the lion disappears, and so does one of their donkeys. And they think that actually the lion has eaten the donkey. And so they're mad at the lion until they find out that the donkey had been stolen by gypsies that were going around. And so they forgive the lion. So that lion is always present when you see Saint Jerome. It's part of his symbolism, and it's an adorable story. Now, the works of Guido Reni are extensive. He produced quite a lot of works. I unfortunately had to pick up only just a few for the sake of time. But his studio was extremely well run. He had tons of students, and it's only at his desk that we'll see that Guercino is going to move in Bologna to replace him. In cities of that size, which were not huge, you could only have one really famous workshop. And so you had to wait until somebody died and to be replaced by another one. The other student of the Carracci is Domenichino, born in Bologna in 1581 as Domenico Zampieri. The reason why the Domenichino is because he was of small stature. And therefore, this is the suffix in Italian, the ino means little. So he got the nickname of Domenichino. He also studied with Denis Calvar and then went on to the Academia of the Carraccis. In 1602, just as we saw with Guido Reni, he left to Rome with Annibale Carracci that used many of the students there to help him in painting the Palazzo Farnese. In 1631, he went to Naples and died in Naples of poisoning. He was very famous. He got many commissions there and attracted a lot of jealousy and ended up being poisoned. Life wasn't that easy. So here are some of his commissions. This is one of the largest one. It's the monastery of Santa Maria in Grottaferrata, also known as the Greek Abbey of St. Nilus, who was founded already in 1004 by a group of monks from Calabria. And the saint who, the monk that founded it was St. Nilus of Rossano, who was a very charismatic leader and an important figure of the time. So, of course, as happened with monasteries, they were updated, they grew. Monasticism was very appreciated at that time. There were lots of monks that were looking at a peaceful life and where they were allowed to study and do things. And also that would provide some security for them if they didn't have enough economic means by themselves. This was a good way to benefit society and benefit the monastery and be able to go on and have a fruitful life. So this is a chapel that was connected to the church and was consecrated by the Abbey's two founders, was remodeled in 1608 and 1610 and then decorated. So Domenichino was responsible for the design of the painted architecture. As you can see again, this is trompe-l'oeil. These are not really moldings, stucco moldings. This is all painted, so it's a smooth surface actually. What we find there are the stories of the founding saints, so as it is dedicated there. And then you have also some female martyrs that are shown, Saint Agnes, Cecilia, and Francesca Romana. In the cupola center that you see there on the right is a panel with God the Father that is enthroned on clouds and flanked by angels. Here are some of the example of the paintings that are decorating the chapel and shows part of the lives of the founding saints, and you can recognize their tunic from that order, and then the building around them of temples, and they're trying to convert people that are building these temples. The story also here shows that while they were approaching the building site, then one of the standing columns began to tilt, threatening to fall directly on top of the person there. And while everybody was shouting at him to jump to safety, the monk very calmly turned to the column and commanded, "Stay." I'm telling that to my dog. Thereupon, the column straightened up, and the miracle was attributed to Saint Bartholomew the Younger, who was standing nearby. No, my dog obeys when I tell him to stay. He stays. Another beautiful representation in that same chapel is this is in San Luigi dei Francesi, that famous church that was dedicated to the French population in Rome, and where many of them were buried, by the way. That absolutely beautiful fresco showing Saint Cecilia before the judge. And you can see how the judge is accusing her of being Christian, and how she very gracefully rejects, his order to reconvert. And in here you see again that classicism that was taught so much by the Carracci. A very pretty rendering. But then the same thing as Raine, he also got influenced by Caravaggio, and the next painting that's probably one of his most famous, The Last Communion of Saint Jerome, shows very much that attraction for the tenebrism that is due to Caravaggio. This is a large altarpiece that is now in the Pinacoteca in the Vatican. This was originally for the church of San Girolamo della Carità, and then was moved. It could have been taken by the French when they typically move from a church to the Vatican. Often it's because it has been plundered by Napoleon at the time. And when it was returned, it was asked to be in a place where everybody could see it. And as the French were very anti-clerical at that time, they didn't want the works to go back to a church. It was considered at that time, when he painted it, as the most beautiful picture in the world. And you can feel in that, for example, before Emin tells me, Rubens is going to have similar composition in the north too. But Domenichino, the same as Annibale Carracci, is also going to be one of the early Italian landscapists. And he's going to produce a whole series of landscapes that are definitely influenced by Poussin and by Carracci, and show these beautiful actually, I'm not saying the truth there because Poussin wasn't there yet, but by Carracci, and is probably going to influence Poussin on the other hand. But very pretty landscape that are fictional. They are not representation of nature, but give an importance to nature that hadn't been given up to now. The third great figure is Giovanni Lampanco, who was born near Parma in 1582. In 1602, came to Rome with Annibale Carracci, and then returned to Parma in 1609 to be called in 12 back by the Pope to come and do some work. And then went to Naples just for 2 years, and then hurried back to Rome. Again, the atmosphere in Naples was impossible for anybody who would rivalize the painters that had set foot there and didn't want to relinquish.
What drew the painters to go to Naples?
Because there was an enormous amount of new churches that had to be decorated. So there was a great appeal for jobs. But as I said, there was a group of painters that were absolutely abominable and didn't let the others share these things. So they did some, but they were so threatened that they would go back. And look, Dominici died there. So it's quite interesting. So again, he helped Carracci, was influenced by Correggio, whose works he saw in the vicinity of Parma. As I mentioned, he went to Naples and then also painted the dome of St. Gennaro Chapel in the cathedral. He was quite influenced by Caravaggio and actually worked with Dominici at some times too. He's kind of a versatile, more eclectic painter than the other two, but I'm going to show you here a gallery that is stunning, that was painted by Agostino Tassi, Giovanni Lampanco, Carlo Saraceni, and Carlo Saraceni. This is called the Salon dei Corazzieri in the Quirinal Palace in Rome, and just an amazing room. So all surrounded by frescoes. But these frescoes are very interesting in the sense that they are describing the main visit, diplomatic visit that happened during that time. And one is quite interesting. And it shows here the shogun Asekura, who has, as you can see, his head on his hand and talking to, so the Asekura was a former shogun who was destined to kill himself because he had lost a battle, but then the emperor gave him the task to go and visit the Western world and try to start some trade routes with Japan. And so for years, he's going to go around Spain and then finally Italy. His full name was Asekura Tsunenaga. And he arrived in Rome in the winter of 1615, just a few months prior to the painting of this frieze. Well, you see there, he's shown in discussion with the Franciscan translator Luis Sotelo, who was a Franciscan monk who he met in Japan and stayed with him for quite a while. Sotelo had the ambition of converting the Japanese and to become the cardinal of Japan. That didn't materialize, though many Japanese for a while had converted to Catholicism, but then were oppressed by the emperor and prevented to go on.
Didn't he also fail to ever open trade?
Yeah, exactly. And so he came, they had a magnificent program on PBS about him. Yes, exactly. And so This was quite an interesting story. So he failed, unfortunately. The Pope didn't want to go along with him. The Spaniards were not trustful. They didn't trust him. And he went back having failed. And he's going to die two years after his return. Mm-hmm. But this is really interesting when you look at it, you know, history is there on these panels. He also painted some of these great ceilings. This was really the fashion that, as we follow again the Carracci, this is the Council of Gods that has been repainted because it had been damaged in the Galleria Borghese in Rome. This is in the Sala della Loggia, opening onto the park of the villa. So what you have Atalantis, and you can see here the Atlantis that's supporting the ceiling or making you believe that, and then all kind of scenes all around in these lunettes. So always the Atlantis are always in grisaille to mimic sculpture. So this that had been left unfinished by Lampanco and became seriously deteriorated was restored in the mid 18th century. Another of his work in San Andrea della Valle, the Virgin in Glory, that beautiful ceiling, that is definitely taking its inspiration from Mantua, the famous oculus by Mantegna. Again, Lampanco had a long career and produced a lot, was really asked for a lot of work. The last follower of the Carracci is Guercino. He didn't go to the Academy, but was very heavily influenced by the Carracci. He was born in Cento, as his real name, Giovanni Francesco Barbieri, but called Guercino because he squinted, he was cross-eyed. And so that became his nickname. He worked in the workshop of Benedetto Gennari and then went to Rome in 1621 to 23. That was after the death of Annibale Carracci. He then returned to Cento in 23. And finally, in 42, following the death of Guido Reni, he moved his own workshop to Bologna to literally replace the one of Guido Reni, and died in Bologna in 66. He did some magnificent series of drawings that I don't have the time to show you, but that show an incredible luminosity. And he's going to move to a kind of a naturalism towards a much more classical style within his lifetime. Here is one of his early work, a donor presented to the Virgin. And where you see again the influence of Caravaggio, you have that more tenebrous style. Very intense feelings are shown in his paintings. Another of the famous ceilings in the Casino Ludovisi in Rome, the Aurora. So that's another one. We've seen one prior, but this is another one. It's almost like a rivalry between two patrons that wanted the same subject. This one is very different to the one we saw before, where the figure of Aurora is more isolated, but it's extremely pretty. Here is an easier view to your eyes that show Aurora with the horses moving her along, and then the figure of time following that is ready with the veil to obscure the room as it is the end of the day. We start seeing with this painting, by the way, more of the di sotto in su, that impression that you are below it and that the painting is going on into the ceiling, which is going to become one of the great marks of Pietro Cortona, you'll see soon. So I suggest we take 5 minutes, and then we'll go on with the completion of the St. Peter Basilica. If you want to have a cup of coffee or a thing, you can put the light for 5 minutes, or take a biscuit, cookie. I always say biscuit. Thank you. So it's amazing to see the quality of these painters that followed, because often you have the master, then tons of pupils, but very few break through. And in this case, these are 4 figures that really had their success. Any question in the on Zoom there? You are very silent. You can unmute for 5 minutes and tell me what you think. No comment. Yeah.
Oh, it's fabulous. It's so wonderful. Yeah, they can't gaze at it enough.
Yeah, for when you see these ceilings, it's always, to me, I see these guys on scaffolding for hours and hours. And
I'm always curious in these, if you think to point out which parts are really frames and which are painted frames.
Exactly.
These are painted doorways, right?
That's quite incredible. And sometimes even on the paint, on a picture, it's difficult to see the difference. It's only when you see the whole image or when you are on site that you can really make the difference. And that's only going to get better. You will see some of these extraordinary domes in churches, in some of the churches in Rome that are unbelievable. Trying to see if we can see better on this one. This is old painting. You see the frame. You see the line. I'm showing you the previous image. You can see the line on the upper right. That is the limit between architecture and painting.
Okay.
So all these forms that you see, these pilasters are painting. It's smooth.
And the idea that to paint it, he has to be very, very close. But to see it, I mean, what he's painting is a complete.
Yeah, but because he has a project, this
right.
was done first in smaller and then they enlarge. Yeah.
All right. So
Yeah. They start with the modello, and that's going to give an idea of the project. And once it's approved, then they go into more detail.
you're standing about 20 feet down.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
To get the perspective right
Yeah.
from that distance.
No, to me, it's always mind-boggling,
Yeah, how did you do that?
how they could do that. They were masters of perspective, but it was not a simple thing.
No.
There's so much geometry involved to draw
Enormous,
angles.
enormous, and it has to make sense. That's the whole idea, is that you can't just decide you do it this way. It has to be quite believable, because otherwise it doesn't work and you lose all that great impression.
I mean, it's one thing to have the idea, but then the technique that goes into making it
Yes.
absolutely fool you,
Yes, and often you had among the workshop or among the group that was painting, you had some specialists in architectural side. So for example, Agostino Tassi, the famous guy who wrote Gentileschi, Artemisia Gentileschi, was a specialist in perspective and architectural detail, and was often used by other painters to do these ones.
So you bring in a specialist.
Mhm.
for one.
And we'll see that's really starting with all these. In sculpture and in paintings, the workshops get really large. and they have specialists in one thing, a specialist in another, some specialists in vegetation, flowers, some specialists in painting hands.
We never mentioned the name.
You can now they're starting to show the names, but this is too cumbersome for me to add it in, because you would have 10 names, you know, on the label.
And that would be the point of the school or
The workshop,
the workshop.
yeah, the studio later.
Group.
Could you try to get them back, because we have to go on. As I say, I have to pick up my son-in-law at the surgeon. Thank you so much. Is Diane there too? They leave the door open then, because she can't get in if. Thank you, and turn it up, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to mute you again, and then we'll hopefully. And we are now moving to architecture. We are going to talk at first about the St. Peter. And as you know, St. Peter, the cornerstone had been put down in 1505. And by now we are in the early 17th century. St. Peter is not finished. And we'll see in a minute, sorry. Yeah. Okay. It took a very long time because of lack of money at the time. They were selling indulgences to bring in, to raise funds to build St. Peter. But they also went through a series of architects that died, and one after the other. So they had some plans, and then the guy died, and then it's another one. And every time he modifies the previous plan. So this was a long time coming. So the important part of the church that had been a real problem for a long time was the dome. The dome had been planned, but nobody knew how to build it. And it's finally with the plan of Michelangelo that the dome is going to be achieved, but not during the lifetime of Michelangelo. It will be finished in 1590 by Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana, who brought the dome to completion at that time. And that was the last year of the reign of Sixtus V. I brought in the Pantheon because it's always interesting. Of course, the Pantheon was such an inspiration for other domes, including the one in Florence. And from Florence, you had the derivation of St. Peter, and then we go on to St. Paul Cathedral in England, and so on and so on. It was the most challenging thing to do because to the contrary of the Pantheon that you see on the right, which is a totally circular building, so the dome rests on circular walls. In the case of St. Peter, you are at a crossing, which means it's square. The base is going to be square, and you have to adapt a round architectural piece to that square. And the way to do it is to make pendentives that you see there, that come, 4 pendentives that rest on these big piers that support the whole dome. And so this is the way, this is actually the way it is already done in Istanbul, in Constantinople at the time, when they did Hagia Sophia. It's also these big pendentifs that make it possible. So following the death of Sixtus V, his successor Gregory XIV had Fontana complete the lantern on top of the dome and had an inscription to the honor of Sixtus placed in the inner opening. Then the next Pope, Clement VIII, had the cross raised on the lantern. So at different times, as many as 10 chains have been installed at various times. Probably the earliest one being already by Michelangelo, because the dome had a tendency to explode. The weight of the dome makes the whole thing move to the outside. And so they put big chains in between the two layers of the dome. You always have an inner dome and an exterior dome. And in between, they put a big chain to keep the dome at that circumference. So finally, 1590, it's done. And then we move to Carlo Maderno. And most of the architects of that time come from that region in the northern part of Italy, which is actually in Switzerland. And having they were typically stonework, stone cutters and so on, but they had no hope of any big job in Switzerland. So they all moved down, and where to go for the best was Rome. This is where everything was happening. There were lots of new orders, therefore new churches. That goes hand in hand. And so he moved to Rome in 1588 with 4 of his brothers to assist his uncle, Domenico Fontana, who we talked about for the dome, and then went on his career. He died in 1629 in Rome. The first great church that he built was that Santa Susanna in Rome. And this is you start seeing the evolution from pure Renaissance to the Baroque, just by the articulation and the projection of these 3 parts. So you see one that is almost level with the other walls, but then you project with the orders here, with the niches, and then the main bay towards. And that's really the beginning of the Baroque, where it starts articulating outside of the pure surface of the facade and having more dynamic rhythm with the columns. The Pope was interested by that and gave Maderno the task of finishing St. Peter, which means finishing the nave that had been extended and the facade. And this is what Maderno did. It's really interesting because it is not respecting the golden rectangle and therefore not as pleasing to our eyes. And one of the very big reasons is the fact that they were supposed to be later some towers on either side of the door. And we'll see that's going to be Bernini's story. We'll talk about that next year. But this explains why, in fact, the golden rectangle is this part, that central part, but the 2 parts on the side would have been the support for the towers, and would have given the appearance to the facade a much more pleasing to the eye. But anyway, this is where it is, and everything was done so that the Pope could appear on the main, on the second floor balcony there. This is where still now, when the Pope has a big declaration or when it's a special day, he's going to appear. This is where he talks from. Just to explain that evolution, here are the plans from the beginning. The first plan was after the foundation in 1506, was by Bramante, and he had the idea of what you call a central plan church. So where you would have the altar here in the middle, and what you had is a Greek cross format. But Bramante died in 1514. 1 year after Julius II, who was the Pope that supervised these plans, died in 1513. And when we jump to the next one, we see that in 1515, Sangalo took over, but he died, sorry, he actually took over in 14 and already died in 1515. The same year, Fra Giocondo had taken over, died also in 1515. And then Raphael took over and he died 5 years later. So when you think about the whole process, you there with not the blueprints as we do now, but they had these plans. And every time they give their own inputs because they think, oh, this would be probably better. And here's the plan by Raphael that departs completely from the Greek cross and sets a nave. And that's probably at the demand of the Pope that wanted to be able to put more people in the basilica. So he makes it a much longer nave. Then we have the sack of Rome in 1527. The next architect takes over a few years after the sack of Rome, but dies in 1536. And then we have, for a very short period of time, Sangalo Jr., who is taking over. Then we move to Michelangelo's plan. And Michelangelo is going to change the choir, as you can see, making it a little bit something closer to that central plan of Bramante, but kind of smoothing the angles, if you want. Definitely all along, we have the idea of a dome. That's really important. But then Michelangelo is going to be shorter. He had a shorter name, and this will be lengthened then later on by Maderno to the plan that exists right now. So Michelangelo dies in 1564. Vignola and Vasari are going to go on for a short period of time. And then finally, starting 1585 to 90, Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana are going to achieve the dome. And then finally, Maderno is coming in 1602 and finishes the St. Peter in 16. So you see the story of a church the size of St. Peter is not an easy story. And here is an image of the famous nave with the baldacchino in the middle by Bernini. Things we'll see again next year. The proportion of that church is absolutely extraordinary. So moving to sculpture, we have some, let's say, not top level sculptures. They produce some interesting works. This is Stefano Maderno. There's still a debate if he's a member of the same family as the architect Maderno. So we're not quite sure. He also comes from the north, though. He also comes from Switzerland. And he did many work. This is the one that you see there, is a Pietà that he made in around 1605. But his main work, and that's absolutely superb, but you don't have the depth in his career that can compare him to a Bernini. But that particular piece that I'm going to show you is extraordinary. And this is Santa Cecilia. That's superb work that he produced, and gives you an idea more or less where the sculpture was moving. And this apparently shows the position in which the body of Santa Cecilia was found when they opened her tomb. And I think it's so emotional. I think when you see that, it's superb. And on her neck, you can see the axe blow that killed her. So it's also that kind of, I mean, don't forget we are now the Counter-Reformation. We are appealing to the emotions of the believers. And this is very much into it. It's not just beauty, it's a lot of emotion. Definitely we'll see that with Bernini next year. Talking about Bernini, his father that was born in Tuscany moved to Naples pretty early and stayed there until he moved back to Rome with the young Gian Lorenzo. And so here are some works by Pietro Bernini, who was a good sculptor, but was completely overshadowed by his son. This is one of his early works, the St. John the Baptist, which is a very good sculpture, but nothing that really takes you, grips you, you know. It's kind of a mixture, and not too much curls in the body. He is known, though, for a sculpture that is very found to the heart of the Romans, is the Fontana de la Barcacha, which is at the foot of the Spanish Steps. So when you go to the Spanish Steps, it's that big fountain at the bottom of it. So that's a Baroque style fountain. As we know, during the Baroque period, we have an incredible amount of new fountains that are going to be built because the different popes have really worked on the aqueducts, repairing the aqueducts and bringing back the water into the center of the city. And these fountains were part of that network that would provide water to the population. So it was not only good to the eyes, but that's the way they often got some water for themselves. Yes.
You know, is this the fountain that the tourists are told you to appoint and you just come back to Rome?
No, that's the one at the, let me see. It's behind, it's a huge one. This is rather small. What did you?
I'm thinking
Because I did it. I know I put a coin. It's yeah, the Trevi, La Fontana di Trevi. La Fontana di Trevi.
Okay.
No, that's an enormous basin with gigantic sculptures. And that's where it's littered with coin. The last sculptor that we'll see is Francesco Martin, who was born in Montevarchi and died in Rome. He is trained by a painter, interestingly enough, but then he really started moving to sculpture, was influenced by Gian Bologna, who is a northern sculptor, and moved to Rome in 1599, continued his training with a Venetian-trained sculptor, Camillo Mariani. He's pretty much a contemporary of Gian Lorenzo Bernini's father, but also will know the son. This is just the base of a sculpture that we will see later on. I'm showing you just a few of his works. This one is quite interesting, actually. This is his first major work. He attracted the attention of the Duke Mario Farnese, and he Farnese gave him the first independent commission of that very large marble Annunciation group for the Orvieto Cathedral. And this is really interesting because you don't see typically the Annunciation as it deals with two figures that are apart. But this is really absolutely beautiful because you start seeing again that Baroque movement and energy. You see just the gesture of the Virgin, who has, by the way, very classical features, but the angel is remarkable in the energy, the dynamism. Look at it's absolutely beautiful. That arm that projects, that tells the Virgin what he's coming for, the expression on the face, just the whole movement of the body is absolutely superb. So this is really a completely new manner to represent the Annunciation in sculpture. But he will then get some commission to make an equestrian statue of the Farnese, of two of the Farnese, one at first. And this, I give you here the kind of history of equestrian statues. The first one and the oldest one is the statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which dominates the hill. Absolutely beautiful statue that was saved by the fact that they thought that it was Trajan, and therefore when the Christianity started, they had melted down all the statues that had to do with Roman emperors. But Trajan was different. He was considered almost an exception before Christianization. And so it was saved, and then it was later reattributed as recognized as being Marcus Aurelius, but it's absolutely superb sculpture. And it's really important to see for these to be able to balance that huge statue on four rather or three rather small legs of the horse. In this case, actually, it's three. So influenced by that statue, Donatello made that equestrian statue of Gattamelata that is in Padua and was the next really important equestrian statue. Very interesting too, because equestrian works like that were supposed to be only for rulers, and Gattamelata was not a ruler, he was a condottiere. But convinced Donatello to do it, and it was done and accepted because of the fame of Gattamelata. Verrocchio went on with the statue of Colleoni, who's also a condottiere, and that one stands in Venice and the Campo di Santi Giovanni e Paolo. Next in line comes then the Francesco Mocchi, the Ranuccio Farnese statue, that equestrian statue that is considered not quite a success. He was trying his best, but it just doesn't quite work as the others. Despite that fact, he was given the commission for another equestrian statue of this time, Alessandro Farnese, and this is about 10 years later. And that one was a much better composition and realization than the others. It's full of energy, it's very powerful. But unfortunately for him, he was a good sculptor, but he's going to be completely marginalized by the genius of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who's going to take over entirely the field. He's anyhow going to be given the commission for one of the four statues at the crossing of St. Peter's transept. You have statues by by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. I'm trying to find Bernini, François Duquesnoy, who was northerner from Belgium, Andrea Boldi, and then this one. These are the four sculptures that were given this commission. And this one is probably the one that fits the least well in the space. Once I'll show you the Bernini, I will show you the fourth of them next to one another. It's a very beautiful sculpture, but it doesn't work as well. It was a difficult task because these are gigantic. They are 5 meters high, so 15 feet. So extremely difficult composition in these nice niches. And niches, by the way, that are carved into the piers that support the dome. So next time we're going to have that. Oh, I'm already salivating. We're going to we will talk about Bernini realism. We'll have 2 classes on Bernini. Absolutely adore that sculptor. He revolutionized the sculpture at that time and really defines the high Baroque period. So this will be on January 6th. As I mentioned to you, on January 4th, I will give, no, that's gonna be, it's on, not the 6th. It's, sorry, I think I made a mistake there. It's on 4th, on the 12th, on the 13th, I think. On the 13th. So, but on your program, you have the good day, normally at the back.
It's a Tuesday.
Yeah, it is a Tuesday. This is part of the Tuesday. And then on the 4th, I will give the talk on the making of the new Louvre.
The slide is wrong.
The what?
The slide. The January 6th.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It is wrong. I made a mistake there. But on the 4th, I give the talk on the making of the new Louvre, the plunder of Europe by the revolutionary, the French revolutionary troops and Napoleon. That's quite an interesting talk. Frances was there when I gave it, and I think everybody was quite interested. So I wish you, yeah.
The that equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, what do they think the date was that was made?
Okay, let me, you should have it on the, you should have it on the.
It wasn't on the slide. The others were dated, but not that one.
It's 100, I think 126. No, that's the Pantheon. Okay, I'll find it and I will let you know.
Okay, I love the little village with the sculpture in the middle.
Okay, so this is the end, and this is a happy holidays.
Oh yeah.
This is my village.
Oh, I love it.
And so I wish you a really happy holidays. I'm going to work a lot. Let me stop.